Well, welcome. Tonight we have a show about an area in town at the center of the universe that's near and dear to my heart, and I believe the oldest active presiding mayor we have. Joe, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Joe Lopes, born and brought up in the Heights, and elected mayor in 1971 of the Prospect Heights Association, which is now entering its 50th year, as you know. We'll talk about that tonight. And it's an organization that needs no introduction in Milford because it's been around so long. But perhaps tonight, in response to your request, Al, we can talk a little bit about how we got there and where we're going from here.
Well, we just put up the new website. So www.Prospect Heights Mayors, all one word, prospectheightsmayors.com. So we have a website that's starting to come together and talk about all the mayors.
I've been on it, and it's a great site. We need to do a little more work with some of the mayors who haven't provided some of the documentation we need to add to it. But it is a good site, and I think it's long overdue. And I guess the next one you're going to work on is the actual Portuguese Club website.
That's the next one.
I understand someone today took a look at the Hudson, Massachusetts website, and they said it's a great website, so you've got some competition for you. But perhaps, Al, as a lead into the whole Prospect Heights phenomenon, if you will, we can talk about the buildings and the design.
Well, let's start with the history. A lot of people don't know. Before you get into the buildings, what brought the Heights about?
At the turn of the century, the 20th century now, at the turn of the 20th century,
I was hoping so.
America was in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, as you know. And Draper's was just one of the new companies that were bursting at the seams with work. And one of their main concerns was making sure that they had adequate labor supply and that they would have that supply for a long time into the future because they saw that they were going to grow exponentially. So Draper's had embarked on a building program in Hopedale. Actually, Hopedale was a part of Milford until about, I think it was 1866, when they broke away from Milford and formed their own utopian town as a result of Reverend Aidan Ballou starting the concept in the little town of Hopedale. Draper Corporation started building houses in Hopedale. They were building wooden houses at the time, single homes and duplex homes. And in fact, they did such a great job that they were recognized with a gold medal at the St. Louis Exposition. And after that, they received a silver medal and two other medals, both at Liège, Paris, and Milan. So they had a great reputation for building company housing. In about the 1850s, the Drapers took a look at Milford and an area contiguous to the Hopedale line, which is up Route 140. And right across there near the Milford Hospital in that dip where the Portuguese Club is now, there was a piece of land of approximately 40 to 50 acres. Drapers bought that in 1857 and did nothing with that land until 1903. And in 1903, they commissioned some of the best architects, designers, and contractors in Massachusetts. They hired Warren H. Manning, who at the time had been working for Frederick Law Olmsted in Boston, one of the foremost architectural designers, landscape designers in the country. They also hired Peabody and Stearns as the design company, and they had built buildings all over the United States of America, well-recognized, prestigious firm. These two groups went ahead and designed and planned, well, actually, let me reverse it, planned and designed the Prospect Heights area. They first wanted to start with row housing, brick row housing. And the concept was similar to what it was in Hopedale. Provide good, solid housing for our employees, and we will assure ourselves of a dedicated, happy, productive labor supply for years to come.
So it's the concept of a company town.
Absolutely, and that was one of the very first concepts in America, the company town. And in 1903, they started the building program in the area called Prospect Heights.
But now, Joe, when we think of the houses in Hopedale that Draper's built, you don't think of row houses.
No.
You know, you think of down off of Route 16.
Absolutely.
Those seem to be the houses for the management.
Right. Draper's had the foresight to see across the country, and they were well-traveled, the Drapers. They had been all over Europe, all over the United States, and they saw that in the Baltimore area and other places of the country, they had what today we refer to as condos. In those days, they were row houses.
Row houses.
And they were ahead of their time and figured that in a small piece of land, they could put an awful lot of apartments, individual homes, if you will. The Heights consists of approximately 50 acres. There are 40 homes in that area. Well, I shouldn't say homes, buildings in that area. But there are 104 individual units within there. Some of those buildings were duplexes, some were 4 apartments, and some were 8 apartment complexes with a firewall in between. But they were one long, solid brick home. They started immediately to offer them to the employees. The condition was you had to be an employee in order to live in the house. And they were coming from all over. The first to gain entrance, if you will, to the homes were the Irish. They spoke English, they were working in Draper's, and as soon as the wooden homes were built across the brook at the time, the Irish occupied the wooden homes, and then the other ethnic immigrants started to occupy the row houses. Armenians, Polish, Portuguese, Italians, as you know.
And Greeks.
And Greek. One Greek family way up on the other side.
There was one Greek family.
Actually, there were two French families and 2 German families, but they kind of disappeared. Nobody ever knew what happened to them.
Nobody ever gave them a flag.
Right. They didn't get a flag from the Mayor's Association. That was the beginning then of the building campaign. The building campaign continued until 1920. The last building built up in that complex was the original Portuguese store / club. They built a club house there because they had a lot of immigrant people there in the neighborhood, and they wanted a place where many of them were single or families were still in Europe, and they wanted a place where these people could come after hours and play cards, read a newspaper, converse with their friends, and just spend some social time together. But they did it for the Armenians also. They gave them an apartment, a 5-room apartment, that the Armenian population at the Heights called their little club, recreation center, if you will. And they were all occupied, and the Portuguese wound up with a market in the same building as the club, and it was the Marx Brothers Market at 118 Prospect Heights, where the new club is now down at the bottom of the hill. That club faces you in that cul-de-sac as you come down from the entrance off of Water Street.
But Joe, now, it was always interesting, because you look when you come into the Heights, you know, as you're coming down, you got the brick row houses.
Yeah.
If you made a right, went over by the 140 side, Prospect Street,
Right.
you had non-brick houses.
Correct. The wooden duplexes.
The wooden duplexes. Were those for supervisory folk?
No. That they just felt, the Drapers felt at the time that they had such success with the homes in Hopedale that they built them with a bathroom. See, the row houses had no bathrooms in them at that time. They had no central heat, no bathrooms in it. When I say bathroom, I'm talking about bathtubs and showers. As they evolved, they said, let's give them an official bathroom in these wooden homes. And they did. And some of the larger families began occupying the wooden homes, albeit the brick homes were consistently occupied. And don't ask me how they did it, but there were families with 8, 9, 10, 11 people in those brick row houses. And one of the reasons why, and we'll get to that when we talk about the War Memorial, but one of the reasons why we had so many youngsters grow up in the area was that there were tremendously large families occupying those homes at the time.
But how did you get selected to live in the wooden houses?
You applied. The houses became available, and it was on a first-come, first-served basis. If the house became available, you applied for it, they picked your name, and you moved over. But they gave it to the Irish first.
Right.
And then the others gradually began moving. But historically, as we had said once before, for convenience sake, for ease of conversation, they had the Portuguese from 1 to 40.
Which amazes me,
I
because
understand.
today, if you ever said,
You'd be
let's say you're
discriminating.
Portuguese,
Yeah.
you can't live in number 41.
Right.
You know, for people who don't understand the Heights, every row house, every unit
Yes.
had a number.
Absolutely.
I mean, to this day,
Absolutely.
if you came from the Heights, you still remember, I mean, I can sit there and say, okay, Joe Duke, number 19.
Yeah, I was Joe number 11.
Joe, number 11. Manny Shavs was number 11.
He came in after we moved out.
After you moved out, the Shavs family moved,
Absolutely.
and I'll always remember Manny and Cisco
Absolutely.
as number 11.
Absolutely.
You got the Froggers in 29 and 30.
Then it changed, Al, I think it was late 60s, early 70s, when North American Rockwell bought Draper Corporation. There was a concerted effort to sell everything.
Right.
As you know, they sold
wanted the
everything in
tax
Hopedale, and they sold everything in Milford. When they sold those homes, those blocks, they sold it to the longest living resident in that block. So if you had a block of 4 apartments, they offered it to the longest resident, living resident
the 4.
in the 4. And if that person bought it, then obviously he now rented it out to whoever he wished and charged rent for that. They did that throughout the Heights.
So all of a sudden, you go from, and it still amazes me that you can say, for whatever reason,
Right.
Number 1 to 40, you got to be a Portuguese to live in there.
Well, it was more convenient to have them there because they were so close together that because of the language barrier,
It
made it much easier for them to converse
But
in
can
their
you
languages.
imagine
and
today
associate.
somebody looking,
Yeah.
saying, well, wait a minute, you're Armenian. You can't live in 1 to 40. You got to live in this area.
That's true.
They would have gotten killed
That's
today.
true.
But, you know, I don't think it was done to discriminate.
No, it was not. It was not done to discriminate at all. It was done really to facilitate the living amongst the population. And as it turned out, and we talked about this earlier, we had diversity in Prospect Heights before diversity became
We never knew the word.
We didn't know the word.
All we knew is you were a kid from the Heights. It didn't
Albeit-
matter if you were Polish, Italian, Irish, you were one of the Heights.
And albeit that the parents perhaps didn't speak English, they would manage to make themselves understood. And the children flourished. The children went to school together, they played together, they went to each other's houses, and they became lifelong friends as a result of that. And another thing too, Al, was remember at that time there were very, very few automobiles anywhere, let alone in Milford. The people in that neighborhood walked from that area, crossed Route 140, up through the woods into Hopedale to go work at the factory.
Yeah,
And they did the
over the
same
hill.
over the hill. They did the same on the way home again. Now, as they were going to work and working in the department and coming home from work, they managed to be able to socialize together, converse together, and as I said, it was they made lifelong friends, even though they were of different ethnic groups during that time. Well, that pretty much covers the design, the landscape design, and the buildings up at Prospect Heights, Al. The Heights was a unique place. Frederick Law Olmsted was perhaps the father of landscape architects in the United States. And Warren Manning worked for him. And when he landscape designed the area, he made sure that there was the brook, which started up on top of, well, Highland Street area, came right down
Now we
where
call it
Shaw's
Hospital
is.
Brook.
Everything underneath, and it goes right straight to the hospital and underneath that area. That brook was open for many, many years, and anyone who remembers the old Heights will tell you that they remember women washing their clothes in the brook. Years later, Drapers went ahead and sealed the brook. They put a cap on it. They didn't seal, but they put a cap on it. So the cap comes from Water Street right at the top,
Almost
across
the
from the
Joe
new
Dukes.
medical building. It comes under the road there,
Right.
and follows all the way down through Prospect Heights where the row houses are, all the way down to the Casey Pool, and all of that is covered. Even though the brook
area
flows,
from Joe Dukes
it's open.
to Wally Costa's.
Yeah, it's a little bit of where there is
open.
open, and from the pool to
Out
the
to the
hospital
hospital
is
is
open. And at some point in time, they're probably going to have to do some work on that Godfrey Brook also. But the design of the heights included placing those trees that I've had two opinions on what the trees are. I thought they were sycamore trees, but I've done some research on it, and I believe that they were cottonwood trees. They are cottonwood trees. Now, those trees are over 100 years old. They're the ones with the bark that falls off the tree, big, giant, beautiful trees. And I remember Tommy Tominski telling me one time that he was a child, and at that time, and now Tommy was already 80 years old, and at that time, Tom said when he was a child, those trees were already fairly big trees. So I figured they were planted on or about the time that they began the construction, namely around 1903, 1904. They're alive and well, they're vibrant, they're beautiful trees, and none of them have died. All of them have survived throughout all these 100 years. They're a beautiful area.
It still gives a wonderful place for shade.
Right.
I mean, that little
Right.
park.
It's a beautiful park, and you know the mayor's contributed to fixing the interior of that area.
We want to talk about the park, but
Please.
okay, so we're sitting there. The Heights has been built, basically built to provide loyalty.
Absolutely.
Because it was kind of hard back
It worked
then to
both
consider
ways.
leaving.
It worked both ways.
Because if you quit Draper's,
Right.
you lose your house.
The rent at the time was $1.40 a week. Drapers provided the job. They provided the maintenance of the property. Everything in the
Even light bulbs. I remember my mother telling me when she was
Absolutely.
in number 8
Absolutely.
that if a light bulb went bad, you weren't supposed to touch it.
They replaced the wooden step. There were wooden steps in those homes at that time. They replaced the wooden steps. They painted them every year. Drapers delivered ice and coal to the homes in those days. Everything was literally controlled, if you will, benevolently by Draper Corporation in order to help the worker be able to have a good, productive life, and especially a family life, because, as I said earlier, the families flourished in Prospect Heights.
But, you know, growing up in the Heights was, I guess it's corny, it was so different. Today, you have to I had to sign up my daughter, I have to drive her around town, everything is so organized. In the Heights, we got home, if it was the season, we grabbed a bat and a glove, you know, or went to play wiffle ball or baseball, or when it was hockey. You know, I remember putting up the boards along the basketball court.
I'm probably going to jump ahead of myself here a little bit in terms of the chronology, if you will, Al. But maybe the difference was that it was a neighborhood. And I say a neighborhood in the true sense of the word. Because we didn't have any cars, we walked everywhere. And because you walked everywhere, you knew everybody. You would pass every house every day.
We had to stop and talk.
Constantly. People are outside, they're inside. You're friendly with all the youngsters in the area, and everybody knows you. Everybody looked out for one another. You left the house maybe early in the morning in the summertime. You didn't come in until they yelled for you at 3, 4, 5 in the afternoon to have supper. The interesting thing about the Heights that doesn't exist today, Al, is that we had the neighborhood schools, for instance. We walked from Prospect Heights
to West
the
Street.
West Street School. We walked, that was grade 1 and 2.
Then
we
Oliver.
walked to the Oliver Street School, that was grade 3 and 4.
See, for me, we went kindergarten. When I moved back to Milford, I got a complex. I go up and look at the West Street School next to the Vietas
Yeah.
and the piers.
Yeah.
There's an empty lot.
Empty lot.
My kindergarten and first grade was West Street.
Yeah,
Then we all walked down to Oliver.
Oliver Street.
Second, third, fourth, and fifth.
But in my time, Al, it was even better because it was 1 and 2 at West Street. It was 3 and 4 at Oliver. And then it was 5 and 6 at the grammar school, which is now the park down by Milford Auto Parts.
See, we never got there.
That lot that's there now is a little park in Milford. That was the grammar school, the Grammar Street School, okay? We then went from there to the Stacy School for 7 and 8.
See, we went to Spruce for sixth.
Okay.
Because that's all there was there.
Here we are, 3 schools within walking distance of Prospect Heights. It was right there.
Well, even Stacy in high school.
Exactly. I mean, we did that also.
We never had a bus. They always said you're from the Heights, you're within 50 miles or whatever the rule was back then.
Absolutely. But again, everything was there, Al. We had that store I mentioned to you right there at the Portuguese Club, the Marx Brothers Market. Up the end of
Guido's.
On the end of the street, we had, again, before your time, I'm dating myself, I know, but we had the Papalian. The Papalian Market was where the new medical building is now, where Jerry's tile place used to be. That was the Papalian Market. About 3 blocks down, right at the top of the entrance to the Heights, was the Consoletti Market, and underneath was his son, Mike Consoletti, the barber shop.
That used to be the treat being a kid.
That's right.
You'd go in there to get a shave because nobody else in his garage down below.
Now, just a little further down the road, we had the Continental Bakery Shop right there on Water Street. And across from the Continental Bakery Shop was Lena's Bar Room.
The bar, which was Lena Guido's.
Lena Guido. Her father built that building, and her father established the business, the Club Royal at the time.
Right.
And she married Nick Guido, and they took it over afterwards and kept it until
and right next door was the height of the walk home, the candy store.
That's right. And then Mr. Salguero took over that market and ran that for many years, and then it changed a few times.
I mean, that used to be you'd go in with a quarter and you thought you were in heaven because you couldn't buy enough candy.
Then after the Second World War, Gene Guido opened Gene's Variety Store, which is still functioning there. So that's why I said earlier about the Heights being a self-contained, self-sufficient area, because you could have done all your business right around that area. And in fact, you had a funeral home halfway down.
Danny's, right?
Right. And before that was Di Pasquale at the end of Water Street. The Di Pasquale Funeral Home was there way before Ruggiero came to town, and he handled almost everything dealing with the Heights area, all the different nationalities.
Now it all goes to Dave Consigli.
Right. Most of it goes to Dave Consigli. So to answer that earlier question you had, that was a neighborhood. That's why people react the way they do to that time and that place.
Well, I mean, I remember when Iandoli's, we thought this was unbelievable. Everybody,
that's right.
My darling bride still laughs at me when I say I'm going to Iandoli's.
Yeah.
Like, it hasn't been that way for
no.
many decades. But you had the bowling alley, right? Everything was there.
Absolutely.
I mean, when we'd go to the band concert in Hopedale, over the hill, we'd go as a group.
Maybe, Al, the other thing we wanted to talk about was the fact that now that building campaign was over with and so forth, all of a sudden you had tough economic times in America.
Well, now you got a building.
That's right.
Everything's set, and you roll right into the Depression.
Depression years, 1929 to 33, thereabouts. Tough times. And yet Drapers had jobs for them. People worked and people survived. And they were thankful for those jobs and thankful that Drapers was doing as well as Drapers did, because it kept them going. And no one ever lost an apartment or a house because of, lack of employment or lack of having a space.
The Drapers, I mean, when you sit there and say the company town, from a benevolent employer standpoint,
absolutely,
you didn't see them, and they could have.
Yeah.
They could have cut benefits. They could have done a lot of cuts back then, because what choice did you have?
You didn't. And then we all of a sudden we realized that we've got the Second World War staring at us in 1940.
So you got this whole group of kids, born and raised. I mean, a lot of them, like me, never spoke a word of English at home.
Absolutely.
I mean, you knew my parents, your family knew them from the old country.
Absolutely. Now you had 1940, we had draftees, we had volunteers, but they were drafting at that time for the Second World War. They were drafting up until age 44. Now, because there were so many youngsters in that area, we had a tremendous number of soldiers who represent the Prospect Heights area. When I say the Prospect Heights area, I'm talking about, Water Street, Lee Street, Lawrence Street.
It's really kind of West Street down to the hospital.
That area we call the Prospect Heights area. And I'll talk about the monument in a minute, but we had 184 Second World War veterans
from our little area.
Those veterans' names all appear on the monument that's in the middle of the row houses in the center of the complex there. That monument was built as a commemoration to the soldiers that Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation in 1950. That was dedicated in 1950. There had been a campaign to raise funds, $2,000, by the residents of the area to go ahead and establish this memorial for the servicemen and women who served from that area. There are 184 names on there, as I told you. Two of those names are of two women from the Heights. Rosalie.
And that was rare.
That
when you
was
think
rare.
about it back there, serving veterans.
Absolutely, serving veterans. There are 9 killed in action. Those names are also on the monument. Adam DiOrio, after the Second World War, became a selectman. And Adam DiOrio at the time felt that we should honor the memory of those people who served by having these monuments throughout the town, the districts that they came from. And he was the guest speaker that day and spoke at the inauguration of the monument. Arthur Canetti was the master of ceremonies. The Milford Daily News at the time estimated that there were 700 people from the area who attended the dedication of that monument. And it still exists today. The original monument was a wooden plaque that was on the other side of the Heights where the field is now, where we have that park. But when they dedicated this monument, it was a granite monument, and it's in the place where it now resides. And you have to think back and realize that the youngsters who were drafted and or volunteered were born in that tough time. They were born in the early 20s. You know, 20s and 30s, and those are the youngsters who served and went to the Second World War at the time. And that, you know, Al, was 1950, and I was just thinking today, knowing I was coming here, ironically, that's when the Korean War started. And the Korean War went till 1955. That monument does not contain the names of any Prospect Heights residents who served in Korea, Vietnam, Persian Gulf, etc. So there are many, many more from the area who continue to serve and continue to represent Prospect Heights.
And maybe we'll talk about that as a project for the next group of mayors.
Well, that's going to be a job they have to do. So right after that period of time, a lot of those veterans who were now home, who returned, who went on to school under the GI Bill, who went to work, who got married, who sought their careers, who moved out of state, etc., because they couldn't all go back and live at Prospect Heights. A lot of the families remained, other families moved out. Like my family at that time bought a home and moved out of the Heights.
But Joe, your family moved out.
Right.
My family moved out of the Heights.
Right.
Okay, I mean, 1941, my mother decided it was time to move out of the Heights. Now, she didn't move as far away as your family.
No, right around the corner.
I mean, my family moved, what, 100 yards?
Well, my family didn't move further either because they're next to the Casey Pool. That's right down the road.
You moved 300 yards
Right,
away. So it's always funny, you know, when you listen to say no matter where you roam, the Heights is always your home. And then you laugh and say, well, your family moved 3 times further than mine. You moved 300 yards.
Well, when those veterans were home now and life was settled for them, they started buying homes, they got married, they had their families. Periodically they would meet and they would do what we're doing now. They would chat about the old times up at Prospect Heights, about the families who were still there. They would visit their relatives and their friends. And it started with little things like, let's have a sandwich and beer together someplace, either at the Armenian Club, and if you remember where Fallon Clinic is now, they had the Armenian Club at that time, or the Club Royal, or the Portuguese Club, and they would go there and chat for 2 or 3 hours in an afternoon. Then some of the guys started developing skits, and jokesters would get up and do their thing. And it soon became a very, very popular event to do this at least once a year. Well, they soon recognized that, you know, the same group of people couldn't continue doing this all the time, and they decided, look, we need to have some organization here. We need to do some prior planning, and when somebody's got to have the responsibility to pull this thing together. So the idea of electing a person to be in charge for the following year came about. And the name of that procedure was going to be electing a mayor of Prospect Heights, representing each of the 5 or 6 nationalities that were part of the Heights, and do it on a rotating basis, so that the first one to be nominated that particular year in 1961 was Flash Moreira, representing the Portuguese population of the Prospect Heights area. And since then, on a rotating basis, as much as possible, every year a different nationality group would be elected to represent that group for the year.
It's every year.
Every year, continuously.
Each ethnic group has the option, if they have somebody.
Absolutely.
But if there's no Armenian or Greek this year, they may pass this year.
Exactly.
So you may end up with 2 Portuguese or an Italian and an Irish.
And that's been one of the concerns for as we go forward, Al, as you well know, is having good candidates who are willing to work, who are willing to take on this responsibility and represent an ethnic group in the future.
But it's also changed, because when you think about Flash, Flash's major role was to play in the reunion.
Oh, yes.
It was a social charter that he was given.
Yes.
We want a new reunion.
Right. We've become an outreach organization over the years, and as you well know, the Prospect Heights mayors have done a considerable amount of work within the area itself, really making 2 beautiful parks for the town of Milford at no cost to the town, absolutely no cost to the town. With the in-kind contribution of contractors and others, and donations that came in from friends of Prospect Heights, we were able to do both park, the interior one and the exterior one leading down to the club. That one alone was well over $100,000 with no cost to the town. And then it was turned over to the town, and the town has taken it over and done a good job maintaining it and keeping it up. We've also, as a group, done a lot of outreach work with charitable organizations, including Milford Hospital, Geriatric Authority, food banks. We give to St. Jude's charity. The most recent one, I believe, was where we donated $500 to St. Mary's Cemetery repaving project, etc. So we've only got, as you well know, Mr. Mayor, we've only got about 26 or 27 active mayors, and on that, with that small group of people, I think we do a great job, helping the town. And
it's always hard when somebody says, "Why the affection for the Heights?" And I grew up in Milford. I grew up in the Heights. What's the first thing you want to do as a Milford boy? Get away. So as soon as I could graduate, I ran to college, graduated college, ran down to D.C., and Washington was wonderful. We left Washington, we ran to Paris. Loved traveling around the world, learned a lot, the Middle East, Africa, Soviet Union. It was all an incredible experience for, my darling bride and I are 22 years old. We're having, fish on the Tigris. We're going up to the gates of Babylon. We're running down to Egypt. But it was funny? When it came down to it, and you say, where do I want to raise my family? And I know it's old-fashioned, it's corny, but there's something nice about going down to the town hall and knowing people that you graduated with, that you know. Being able to ask somebody. I can't imagine when we were in Paris, trying to go in and see the people who ran the city to complain or ask for help. But I can't imagine not doing that in Milford.
True.
Sue Clark, fantastic job. $750,000 that she got us a grant. And it was funny because one of the things that came up, the old days, you had stones held with cement. That was the sidewalk. Well, the highway department is telling us that won't work. With the new big plows, they're going to rip those things up every year, and you just can't have them. So Sue called and said, what do we do with these stones? There is a mountain of little stones. And it was funny because I really feel good that I picked up the phone, called 2 mayors, Tony Gonsalves,
Yeah.
even though he spells his name wrong, and Joe Batts,
Yeah.
and they didn't even blink.
Sure.
It was like, well, we'll find part of our home, we'll find a place,
Store 'em.
store the rocks,
And then we'll do something with it.
and then someday, as a mayor's project, we'll integrate them back.
It's interesting you mentioned that about you going away and coming back. Another analogy very similar to yours is my own son. He worked for the federal government. He was in Newport for several years. He went to Holland, worked for the government, doing C3 stuff with the military. My grandson was born in Holland. We went out to see him several times, came back, went back to Newport, worked there as an engineer, electrical engineer again for a while. And then after having lived in Newport for several years, said, "Hey, Dad, do you still have that lot behind the house?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." He said, "I think I'd like to come back to Milford and live in Milford." And that makes the full circle to your story.
Absolutely.
But let me also bring up something else, Al, as to your conjecture about, why do people always come back to their roots, and what is it about the heights that intrigues people? About a month ago, I'd say it was about a month ago, there was a story, maybe 3 weeks ago, there was a story in the Sunday Globe about the west end of Boston. The west end of Boston is down the bottom of Storrow Drive, up around Mass General Hospital, that area. In the 1950s, the city of Boston decided to raise that whole section, took over buildings by eminent domain, got people out of the area with a promise that they would settle them somewhere else in Boston and so forth. Well, they did that. They eliminated everything, demolished everything. There are great pictures in the newspapers showing the place razed, completely razed. Well, people today are forming organizations to remember the West End of Boston. They want to keep the memories alive. They lived there. It was their neighborhood, and they're sorry that it has disappeared from the map.
Sure.
And they're trying to get some people together to see if they can resurrect some of those memories that they had at the time. In addition to that, there was a program on PBS about 2 weeks ago, 2.5 weeks ago, called Pride and Passion, Italians in America. And it gave a history of Italians' contributions to America. And it focused primarily in New York City and what the Italians did in New York. And the desire that these immigrants have to remember their roots in the New York area and what the Italian Americans were able to contribute to the United States of America since those early immigration days to Ellis Island. All of a sudden, this past Sunday, there was a great article by an Armenian documentary maker, filmmaker in Watertown, Massachusetts. And he is documenting the relationship of the Armenian community of Watertown to the Hood Rubber Company of Watertown, Mass. Now, I think the Armenian population in Watertown is a fairly substantial, large population. And again, the article and documentary is going to talk about what Hood provided that Armenian population in terms of jobs and consistency, etc. Even though they didn't own the homes, but they had the jobs there, and it meant a lot to the Armenian people. Why is all this happening, across the country? Why are people, answering the question that you just asked about their roots and their neighborhoods? We lost something. It was a different place and a different time. America was different then. The pace of technology is such today that it's difficult to be able to do the kinds of things we were talking about doing before, such as walking in the neighborhood every day, talking to your neighbors every day, associating with your peers in a friendly way every day.
When I moved down to D.C., I was in what they call townhouses. They didn't want to call them row houses anymore.
No.
They had to come up with a new marketing name. So it was a townhouse. There was a cul-de-sac, and there were 20 of them. Just like the Heights, only instead of an upstairs and a downstairs, there was one home. When we left for Paris, we knew most of the 20 families because it was a little cul-de-sac. You walked around, you got to talk to everybody. Came back 4 years later, 2 were left. 2 families out of the 20, everybody else had moved.
See?
And it's amazing because, you know, I hear people who move into town. Well, New England's cold. You don't get to meet people. And it's funny, you get into habits. I mean, Christmas Eve, I can't tell you why, but a decade or 15 years ago, the Coffees invited us over to share their Christmas Eve dinner that they have with their family. Dave Consigli showed, I mean, everybody's there. We're not family, but we go there every year. It's kind of an honor that they invited us.
Absolutely.
And yet here it is 15 years later. We go to Cheryl Hayes', we go to early Mass, we go to Cheryl Ann's, and then to the Coffees.
And you have a neighborhood.
And it's been the same people. You've watched their kids
Absolutely.
grow up.
Absolutely.
I mean, we laugh because you talk about a documentary. Allison Ferrucci has volunteered to be the producer, director, I mean, basically the person who knows what to do, because none of us do, to do a documentary of the Heights.
Sure.
And it hit us because we lost a couple people this year.
Yes.
That,
Yes.
you know, Allison had an opportunity at the last reunion last fall
That's
to
right.
interview him.
That's right.
And you sit there and you don't want to be morbid, but
Well, that's why it's important that we capture this,
Exactly.
Al, and that we don't lose it. And I think that I would be remiss, for instance, if I didn't mention at this time and piggyback on what you've just said. A young lady back in 1988 by the name of Constance Banicki was a student at Roger Williams College in Bristol, Rhode Island. Part-time student. She was a full-time worker at Bose. But she was a historical preservation major at Roger Williams. And she had a project that she had to do for an internship program with the college in order to get her bachelor's degree in historical preservation work. Connie had moved to Milford and decided that she was going to take on the nomination of Prospect Heights for the Historical Register of Massachusetts. She looked at the Heights and the concept of the company town and thought that Prospect Heights in Milford was an absolute unique place. And as you and I know, it is. So Connie did a proposal for Roger Williams, and she doesn't even know me, and she doesn't know I'm saying this, but I've researched it enough to realize that she deserves a tremendous amount of credit for the work she did. She worked almost a whole year in researching, interviewing, visiting, collecting, giving presentations to everybody. She did such a good job that the Historical Commission of Milford appointed her an associate member of the commission. And in 1990,
that was in September 5th.
right, in 1990, September 5th, we, Milford, received notification that the Historical Commission of Massachusetts accepted the nomination of the Prospect Heights historic area to be accepted as a historical district in Massachusetts. And we have that honor and that privilege today. And it was all due to the work of Connie Banicki with the supervision of Lynn Lovell, who is still on the commission, the Historical Commission. And I think that in itself speaks to the fact that not only was Prospect Heights a concept on the part of Drapers that worked for Drapers, worked for the people, and in essence worked for the town of Milford. Because no matter where you go and you talk about it, everybody says the kinds of things that we're saying right now. Anyone who knows about the Prospect Heights.
Well, let's talk about, I mean, when I think back some of the memories, you know, you grew up on the corner by the rock, and our parents hated that we hung out at the mailbox.
That's right.
You sat on the mailbox. It was kind of like if you were from the plains or the area, you went down to the wall in front of Stacy. For us, it was sitting at the mailbox. But there was a little baseball park there. And you could remember getting closer and closer to be able to hit the ball as far as the fence.
True.
And there was a rite of passage if you could get Guido to yell at you because you bounced the ball off his roof.
All right.
That was one of those things that, okay, I've made it. I can hit the ball far enough.
Yeah.
And poor Mr. Guido.
Yeah.
You felt bad for him, but I'm sorry. I want to grow up. So part of me growing up is hitting the ball on your roof and having you yell at me. Talk to me about some of the memories, the picnics, the parades.
You see, because again, as we said earlier, Al, it was a different time and a different place. I like to refer to it as a very innocent time. Children were let out of the house until sunset, darkness.
Until it got dark and your mother yelled, time to come in.
They were on their own because they were safe. First of all, there weren't a lot of cars up and down the streets. But there was a group of people who took care of each other and looked out for each other.
If you were out in front of Paul Vallis's house, you know his mother was on the porch watching.
Absolutely.
God help anybody
absolutely.
that tried to harm a kid.
And you had within the neighborhood, you had enough space to roam around, play up and down the streets, in the playgrounds here and so forth. And we would do everything within this area. You didn't have to leave the confines of this area in order to have a good time. Now, the ethnic groups would at least once a year, and some of them even more periodically than that, would have, for instance, a get-together, have people get together, not only from their ethnic group, but would invite the community and the whole town. The Polish had picnics, the Italians had picnics, the Portuguese had picnics, and these were annual picnics.
But we had the biggest picnic.
We're the ones who still continue today, the only ones. And Al, to be fair, it's really as a result of the continuing immigration over the years that the Portuguese had versus some of the other nationalities. The Armenians were not immigrating to this country in any great numbers.
Well, no,
the Italians,
they kind of peaked out because where Fallon was, you had an Armenian club. Back then, that was a pretty impressive club.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And as you know, eventually, because of declining membership, they sold it. But the neighborhood had these kinds of activities available for both the children and the adults who would continue to be able to bring their relatives, their friends, their families together, at least during those times, to renew acquaintanceships and friendships, etc. The rest of the town would plug in and piggyback on it, and it got to be well known as it is today when you'd get 10,000 people on a weekend to come to our local picnic up there.
It's a big picnic, 10,000 people.
But the community did a bunch of other things. For instance, we have a picture up at the club, and I think I just barely remember it as a youngster. When victory over Japan was announced, Milford had a giant parade. And the Portuguese club designed and put a float in the parade, the VJ Day Parade in Milford. And it was a symbolic tank or something, all decorated with soldiers on it. The picture's up at the club. They won the best float for that parade. In 1976, what do? We had a bicentennial in Milford. A bunch of us, including my friend Joanna Shuk Polish, were on the committee to develop and design a float for the 200th celebration of this country. And the theme of the celebration was Peter Francisco Day. Peter Francisco was a Civil War hero in this country, Portuguese extraction, and we used him as a symbolic individual for the dedication of that parade because he was a Civil War hero. We won the contest for the best parade, the best float in the parade, the best theme for the bicentennial parade in Milford. Again, local representation, local people contributing and doing the job. That old club that I referred to earlier, in terms of memories now, served countless hundreds and hundreds of people over the years with weddings and parties and you name it up there. The community got so large that the building actually, I was always afraid that the whole top floor was going to cave in. There's so many people would go to it.
It's amazing. You talk about the community. I can still remember the Milford Daily News coming out, and they would list the 200 graduates. My mother taking her little red pen and circling every name, because she knew every Portuguese family,
Right.
circling them all.
Absolutely.
You know, and how proud the community was.
Absolutely.
You know, you think about you doing the college route.
Yeah.
There weren't that many that did it.
No.
You know?
No.
But back then, you knew the 8 people that graduated.
Yeah, and those are the kinds of memories you have. For instance, the Portuguese Club in my time was the first place in Prospect Heights to get a TV set. It was a small 10-inch Fada. That was the name of the TV set, F-A-D-A. A small 10-inch Fada that they had in the club, in the open bar area.
Downstairs at the bar.
When the club was half the size, a little room really. And the president of the club lived across the street. And he would come and open the club door before the membership started strolling in after supper for the children of the area. I don't know if it was Howdy Doody or what the show was at the time. I don't recall. But we would all gather and sit on that sidewalk that you talked about earlier with all those stones, those pebbled stones that were there, and wait for him to come out of the house, cross the street, open the door of the club, and then wave us in. He would wave us in, and everybody was respectful, no noise, no hooliganism, and they would sit at the tables. He'd turn on the TV set, and that program would come on. The parents would give you a dime or a quarter, and you'd buy a soda and a bag of potato chips. You'd watch the TV show. As soon as the show ended, he'd say, "Out, out," and everybody would flock out the door, waiting for tomorrow night to come back.
Because if you showed any disrespect, number one, you didn't want to go in front of your parents.
And every night, that was the meeting place at that hour, whether it was 5 o'clock or 5:30 or whatever. And then afterwards, the membership would begin strolling in to play cards or to read a newspaper.
Dominoes.
Or to just share the news of the day with each other. But those were the kinds of things that you hearken back to and you remember. The great meeting place, the great center of attraction in the Prospect Heights was the Marx Brothers Market.
Joe, it's amazing when you think of the things that mean nothing, but really mean everything.
Oh.
You know, I drive by the basketball court. I can still remember arguing with David Alves, calling pitches that I swore were not in the strike zone that Alan Alves threw. And you'd sit there and accuse them of an Alves conspiracy. But you know, it was funny because you always tried to learn the jokes first. Because if you didn't learn them first, they weren't Italian jokes, they became Portuguese jokes. Because it was all the same jokes. And like you said, the diversity thing, we never knew it, we never understood it. Because first of all, there were always kids from Milford and the Heights.
Al, you mentioned graduation and your mother circling names in the book. My graduation class at Milford High had 5 students from Prospect Heights in the graduating class. One was Joe Onischuk, Polish. One was Gus Lancher, Italian. One was Zari Zarkisian, Armenian girl. One was Margaret Bozan, Armenian girl, and myself. We graduated together as part of the class, of a very small class. On prom night, I took Mani Bozan to the prom. Joe Onischuk took Zari Zarkisian to the prom. Okay? That's how close a group we were. And you talk about diversity, there's 4 or 5 right there in that group. We're still friends today. Gus passed away 2 or 3 years ago, a mayor of Prospect Heights representing the Italian delegation, if you will, of Prospect Heights area. And the rest are alive and well, and hopefully we'll continue to be friends for the rest of our lives.
And I think that's, when you really look at what the Heights gave us, it was the values.
Absolutely.
It was a set of core values that you really did learn to value somebody for who they were, not where they came from, not, you know, you hate to say color, shape, size, creed, what, you know, it was the person.
Those people worked hard, Al. They made a lot of sacrifices. They didn't read, write, and speak English for the most part when they came here, other than the Irish.
But they got by.
But they got by, and they worked hard.
And I remember my poor father, he never knew why, but if somebody told him you're supposed to be down at the school, he put on his coat, he put on his little hat.
Absolutely.
He showed up.
Yeah.
He had no idea 90% of the time why he was there, but all he knew is he was supposed to be there to support his family.
Absolutely.
And if he had to walk, he walked.
Absolutely.
Because the cars, until they started going to General Motors and needed a car, nobody could afford to buy a car.
And that's why, Al, you know, our peers and the Heights mayors, they represent that time and place. All of them, for the most part, had fathers and mothers who grew up during this period of time that we're talking about. They were children growing up. Some of them were adults already when all of this happened, and remember it very well. Many of them worked in Drapers themselves before they moved out of town and come back, because they remember very vividly the kinds of things we're talking about. It's interesting to note that, you see, today, Prospect Heights has changed, like we all have changed, and the world has changed, and America has changed. Most of the people don't remember that Drapers was involved. Most might not know that Drapers built that and why they built it.
Or what Drapers was.
They live there, but they have no concept, because for the last 20, 25 years, they've been paying rent to an individual landlord, not the Drapers. Drapers doesn't do the maintenance. Drapers doesn't deliver the ice. Drapers doesn't paint the place. The parents don't work in Drapers. Drapers no longer exists. But for us, it was an important time, because we know the impact it had on our parents, and in turn, what that impact had on us. You know, and you went to college,
Joe,
and I
we're coming down to the end. The future. We're coming up to the 50th year of the mayors, and again, out of respect for everybody before us, I think the greatest decision was the 50th mayor will be all the mayors.
All the mayors.
Where does the Heights go in the future?
Well, this is the concern we have to deal with as an organization after the 50th, which, by the way, for the viewing audience is going to be, I believe, the third week in October.
October 17th.
October 17th. And I know you're going to get a lot of information out to the public about this. It should be an interesting, great time for reflection and for bringing together all of our friends.
Well, we got 30 seconds.
We hope that we can continue and march forward in the future. It's going to take a lot of effort on the part of everybody, and I just hope that we get great, strong candidates to continue the tradition that's been started for the last 50 years. Well, thank you for inviting me.
Oh, thank you for coming on.
I appreciate it.
And again, to the 6 core people, and we have a few more joining us, listening every week, we want to thank you. The Heights is a special place. It always has been a special place. I mean, I'm sure that when we look at the Plains, and Joe D'Antonio and them will tell you, the Plains is a special place, and maybe someday we'll have their Joe Lopes.
But they've only been around, and I say only, they learned from us. I think this is their 26th year, and you know, we're 50 years.
There you go. So to everybody at the center of the universe, again, thank you for joining. Good night. May God bless, and let's hope that we have another 50 years and that our children get a sense and a feeling like we did for Milford as a special place at the center of the universe.
Hear, hear.
Good night and thank you.
Thank you.